If you can see it small and dream it big, then you can scale it up. The micro inflames and informs the macro, and when you push beyond the confines of your personal and professional canvases, you'll begin to live large and create vast and vibrant images and impact. Hey, my friends, welcome back to the UNCOMMODiFiED podcast and to another UNCORK conversation. Today, my guest is vibrant, large-scale mural artist, Steph Boutari. Steph, welcome to the show.
Hi, thanks for having me.
It's going to be a lot of fun. Let me introduce you to Steph. Steph is an artist based in the Waterloo region in Canada. For those listening who aren't in Canada, that's about an hour or so west of Toronto. She's best known for her colorful and vibrant large-scale murals, which can be found in public spaces and businesses around the region where I live and beyond. Steph began painting murals while studying architecture at the University of Waterloo, and after graduating from a master's program in 2014, she worked as an architectural designer while pursuing mural art independently on the side. And then finally, in 2017, Steph, I think you got the message from the universe and said, hey, I'm going to do this full time. I'm going to make this my life's work. And now Steph's work has appeared in a variety of local publications and media, and she's created stunningly bold, beautiful, and big impact murals for notable clients like Starbucks Coffee, the Bank of Montreal, Home Hardware, and Google, or Steph, as I like to call it, the Google. I call it the Google. I think that's just an old man way of talking about Google, the Google. But of course, all these conversations, UNCORK conversations, start off with a drink. So Steph, what are we going to drink together to get this conversation started? What do you got there?
I have here a Cowbell Shindig lager.
A Shindig lager. Okay, you're going to have a Shindig. I like that. I've got, this is out for the YouTube channel. I got a Lake of Bays, which is a local brewery up in northern Ontario. I've got it's a low tide. It's actually a 2.5% IPA, which is now going to be all over my computer in a second. Oh, that's good. Cheers to you, Steph.
Cheers.
Awesome. Every conversation goes better. Sort of like the conversation we had one time around a campfire. Remember that one?
Yeah, I do.
I think we maybe had a similar drink. No, actually, I think
we had bourbon.
We had bourbon that night. Yeah, Steph likes the bourbon as well, which I appreciate.
Yes, I do.
Awesome. Excellent. So Steph is also a neighbor of my son and daughter-in-law. So that's how I originally got to meet Steph, and that was awesome, and learn a little bit about what she does and how she creates these great things in her life. So Steph, let's kick off the conversation this way. So how did you get into this very, very interesting career? Because I don't think I've ever met a large-scale mural painter before, and I'm almost 60 years old. So it's not the most usual expression of art. So explain a little bit about your journey. How did it find you? How did you find it? Where did it start? Let's unpack that.
Okay, yeah. It is a very unconventional way that I went about it. But if we rewind back in time, art was always my favorite thing to do. Like, even when I was a young child, there's photographs of me drawing just hours. You could leave me with crayons and paper. And then obviously as I grew up as a teenager, I was obsessed with painting, and I would even occasionally ditch other classes. And when I was doing A-levels, it's the British school system, but you get free periods where you can. So I would spend my free periods in the art department, and then once or twice I was like, oh, I don't need to go to this class, I already know what I'm doing, like I'll just sneak into the art department and do more. So it was definitely like my identity, and I think everyone, like my friends and family, always knew I was going to do something art related. But at the end of the day, you know, when I graduated high school and I was thinking about university, I simply just didn't have the courage to kind of like take that leap into art. Like, I'm going to study art, I'm going to be an artist. I just thought, you know what, I'll keep doing it on the side, like as a hobby, and then maybe I could do something creative, but that's a little more financially safe in my mind. So I was interested in architecture, but I didn't know anything about it. So my first year of university, actually I was required to take a whole bunch of different courses because they don't let you pick the program right away. This was in the University of Toronto, actually. And then so I took a few architecture courses, but then by the time, partway through the year, I learned about Waterloo's architecture program through a friend, and I realized that that was actually much more kind of creatively inclined than than the U of T program, because it was more studio focused and less about the lectures and more about like hands-on drawing, and there was the co-op aspect. So I ended up switching to Waterloo. And then, so it was a longer program, and you know, it was 5 years, including co-op. And I found that basically by the end, I felt like I loved architecture, but not all aspects of it. Also, my experiences working for firms made me realize this more so than the academic side, because in school, you know, it's more creative, you're more like proposing crazy ideas, whereas, you know, in the workplace it's just like boring condo layouts and whatever. But anyways, so I was a little discouraged, and I wasn't sure if it was really what was meant for me, but I felt a lot of pressure because of the investment into my education that, you know, I still have to see this through. So then I was like, okay, so the next step, I have to do the master's degree, because that's the only way you can get your license. And I still had this like doubt in my mind, but the thing about the master's program is that you have to do a thesis, and it's very, like, you have complete freedom. You can do any topic you want as long as you can tie it back to architecture somehow, and they give you really like a lot of leeway in that sense. And it's very much self-directed. You just, you know, explore a topic, do a whole bunch of research, and you can do, it doesn't all have to be written work as well. Like, it could be a combination. Well, you do have to write an essay, but you can do exploratory design work and things like that. So then I was like, okay, you know, I really miss art, I miss painting. What if I find a way to bridge this love I have with architecture? And so I started studying, first I started studying color in architecture, because that was something we never in school ever were taught or looked at. It was all about like making these pristine white models and, you know, wooden models. It was all about the form, and the surface of things was considered kind of like superficial, like, oh, that's just for interior designers. Like, so we never talked about color, we never talked about surface. And so that kind of became my thesis argument, that, you know what, like, why don't we? Like, the surface and like the paint on the walls, it's the first thing you see, it's the first thing you touch. And so my argument was like, actually, this is kind of architecture. And then I was looking at all the kind of ways in which that boundary between art and architecture gets blurred. And so I looked at a lot of public art, a lot of, you know, murals, some sculptural work, and also the ways in which architects were creatively treating the facades of their buildings through not just color, but pattern and even like LEDs. And so that kind of became my whole thesis. And as part of that, I grew interested in murals, and I attempted my first mural as, you know, my attempt at exploring my theories. So there was this building literally right across from the School of Architecture that I thought this wall would look great with a mural on it. And I wanted to kind of basically paint this new architecture. So I'm changing the way that architecture is read and experienced by other people through the paint. And that was kind of my argument. But I had no experience doing that at all. And I wanted to use spray paint because I saw a lot of these mural artists and graffiti artists use spray paint, and never used that before either. But, you know, I just found out who owned the building, and I contacted him, and I just said, like, hi, like, would you like a mural? Like, I'm interested in blah, blah. And he was so nice and actually was, you know, happy to oblige. And he even agreed to cover my paints. Like, obviously I wouldn't expect my labor to be covered because I'm the one asking him and I had no experience. But the fact that he was even willing to cover the paint was huge. Because I was a student, like, I didn't have any money. So, yeah, and I just showed him a concept and he liked it. Like, he didn't have any feedback or any kind of interference. Like, he's, to this day, one of the most easygoing clients I've ever had. But yeah, so it was very difficult. It was a slow learning curve, obviously, with spray paint, and it took longer than I thought. I thought I could just, honestly, I don't remember how long it took, but it was sometime in the late fall that I had started, and then I realized I'm not going to finish this before the snow comes. So I had to actually do the second half in the spring. But but it honestly, it all kind of took off from there, because even while I was a student, someone saw that mural, and I got hired to paint another mural, which I was still doing my thesis, but so I incorporated that as part of my thesis too. And then later, when I graduated, of course, I still didn't think I could make a career out of this, so I started working for an architect. But then this first mural that I did, the building owner, he owned another building, and he reached out to me to hire me like properly to paint this other building. So I'd come, back from Toronto on the weekends to Cambridge to paint this. It was like 200 feet long. I had a much simpler approach to that design. Like, I didn't cover the full wall. Like, I had a lot of negative space, because that would have been crazy for my experience level. And I actually hired an assistant to help me out. And there were like some moments where I was like crying with frustration at things, but I was so happy in the end. I guess eventually I had enough inquiries while working, in architecture, to feel like it was worth taking that risk. Because at the end of the day, I'm like, well, I could always go back to architecture if this doesn't work out. But I mean, frankly, the push that I was given to quit was, I was so stressed at my job at that point. Like, there were some changes in the way things were happening in the job I was working at, like with people, and to me it kind of was becoming a bit of a toxic workplace, if I'm being honest. But I did like the work itself for a really long time, and then certain people there, which is why I stayed as long as I did. But then I started getting so stressed that I developed health issues. I was having like chronic acid reflux and stomach pain, and then my appendix burst. And then I took that as a sign. I'm like, you know what? I need to stop this.
Wow.
So yeah, I mean, I don't know. I just interpreted it that way.
That
Yeah.
but it's interesting though as you describe that journey, because and this is kind of I think an interesting thing that I've noted in my own life and in other people's lives over the years, stuff is that sometimes what happens is that we need a challenge or a challenging situation to actually cause us to move in the direction that we're supposed to move. And so if you think about it, if your career and that environment you were in was wonderful and it was happy and you weren't getting, quote, sick from it, you may have stayed who knows how long or forever. And so in some ways this pain point becomes a bit of a provocation for you, and maybe a little bit of a knock or a kick in the ass to say, hey, maybe there's something else for you. So I mean, it's a really fascinating journey, and I love seeing how that developed. You got this architecture and art thing, and you're recognizing that the architecture doesn't really take a lot in stock about what a wall feels like and looks like, and now you want to express yourself that way. So take me back for a second. Now you talked about A levels, which I would assume then you were not educated in Canada up until that point, because A levels are not in Canada. So where were you born, and how did your journey find you here?
Oh yeah, I should have started with that. I grew up in the Middle East, in Bahrain.
Okay.
So Bahrain's a small island next to Saudi Arabia. That's how I describe it to most people here. Haven't heard of it. Yeah, my parents are from Egypt originally, so I was an expat. So I grew up there. They were expats living there. At the time, over 50% of the population of the country were expats from countries all around, not just in the Middle East, but from, UK, America, Asia. So I grew up in a very multicultural environment, and most of the expats there, basically, to go to an English-speaking school, you either would go to a British school or American school. Those were like the main options. And so I don't know how they decided, but I ended up at the British school. I had an accent. I don't anymore, but when I first came to Canada, to people here, I sounded British.
Okay.
But I don't think I ever did.
Interesting. So did you go to school in Britain then?
No, sorry. It was a British
okay,
school
so you
in
went to
Bahrain.
so you went to a British school in Bahrain, but because of the influence from the British culture and teachers, you actually picked up a little bit of a maybe British accent. That's kind of fascinating,
Yeah.
actually. That's very
All the
interesting.
teachers were British actually.
Okay, interesting,
Almost all of
interesting.
them, yeah.
So, what age did you come to Canada then?
I was 18. Basically, after high school, most of the people I went to school with went abroad for university. The options for university in Bahrain were very limited. So, and then also part of the plan was my family were going to all move to Canada. So my mom was the applicant for permanent residency, and my sister had already come to Canada 2 years before I did.
Hmm.
But in the end of the day, they didn't go through with that for a bunch of reasons. So me, my sister, and my brother are Canadian now, but my parents stayed back home.
Okay. Okay,
Yeah.
so that's quite a journey. So let me ask you, you talked about loving art from a young age. So, I mean, typically, I mean, I think about, my grandkids and they're quite young now, and I watch them paint, and they paint typically on fairly small scale paper that they're given. Sometimes a little bit bigger stuff that we might give them to do, but they work fairly small scale. I think that's typical of most people. I mean, depending if you got an iPad, you work on an iPad size, if you draw or do something, or you have a sketchbook, and sketchbooks are relatively small. How do you begin to realize somehow that this sketchbook and this paper can't contain what you want to do? I mean, how do you go from this, seeing things in small scale, because life is small scale, I suppose, particularly compared to the kind of drawings you're doing and the murals you're doing on these buildings. How did you start to realize that somehow the paper was going to be too much of a boundary of how you could express yourself?
Wow, that's a good question. I guess, well, actually, this came up one time in a conversation before that my art teacher in high school, who honestly was the hugest inspiration, and she really believed in me.
Hmm.
We all, as part of our program in A-level art, we had to have sketchbooks, and we had to be working in them constantly to support the body of work we were creating.
Yeah.
And there were different size sketchbooks. So you could have like the little square one or A5 or A4, but you could go as big as A0 if you wanted. And there was no grade difference. It's just up to your style preference. And in the beginning, I was working very small, and my teacher, she like identified, I don't know, she could somehow tell that it wasn't suiting me.
Interesting.
She, like most people ended up with a kind of in between size. Most people were working with like A3. But she was like, you need to go the biggest size. Like this is your style. I don't know how she sensed that, and honestly, like it definitely, it's like I broke out of my shell. Well, maybe one layer of the onion, like maybe not the shell, but by doing that. And I guess like the next stage of like the bigger scale, I think, was once I had the sort of architectural influence, and then I
Yeah.
was thinking about murals. I could no longer just, if I'm thinking about, oh, this could be on a large scale,
Yeah.
I would always be drawing a little person next to my drawing, and then imagining, and then drawing people at different sizes, like
That's that's
to try to
fascinating.
imagine, because,
That's fascinating.
well, I guess like in architecture you're always drawing things at a smaller scale anyway, so I kind
Sure.
of was used to that, like, the scale thing.
Yeah.
And yeah.
You know what's interesting though too. So let me ask you: would you remember the teacher's name?
Yes, Mrs. Smart.
Mrs. Smart. Well, she was
Yeah.
obviously quite smart. Because the reason I bring that up is that, I mean, and you even sort of muse. How did she know this? She had this intuitive sense somehow that you had a boundary of the edge of that paper that was going to confine you, and you needed to somehow release yourself from it. And again, if you're listening into the podcast, I mean, the thing that I'm thinking right now is, maybe you have somebody in your life, personally or professionally, that whatever they're doing in life or business seems too small for them, and that you recognize that they have a greater capacity or a greater canvas that they're supposed to somehow be painting on in their life. And I just want to provoke you and say, hey, if you have somebody in your life like Mrs. Smart did with Steph, maybe you need to give them some permission or call them beyond what they're doing and saying, I think there's a bigger canvas for you to be working on. And metaphorically, you can think about that as an artist, but you can think about it, I think, about like a canvas, the place we get to draw our impact and influence. And I just think that's a really interesting part of this journey for you, Steph, is that you've got a person who calls this out. And it is, as you've talked, you've got these two moments, and it's interesting. I don't know, this is the way my brain works, but at one moment in time, you've got a person who provokes you to move beyond the restraints of your canvas. And then you've got a pain, a palpable pain in your life later on that moves you out of the traditional architecture world, and it moves you. So you've got these two provoking influences. One is a person, and one is some personal pain. But they become provocateurs that push you out or cause you to expand your own belief about yourself. And without them, maybe you're still either working on A4 paper. And for those of you who live in Canada, we don't talk A4. That's 8.5, 11 or so.
Like letter size.
Yeah, letter size, 8.5, 11.
Yeah.
Those of you who listen to the podcast around the world, you know what A4 is. But the reality is, you also we're going to be constrained by traditional architecture. So you've got these provocateurs. One is a person and one is pain. And that's really fascinating to me, Steph, because without these, you probably aren't quite doing what you're doing today, which is amazing to me. So do you wake up one day, are you walking down the street and you look at a building and say, I could paint on that? Like how do you, really, most people would see that as that's graffiti and probably illegal. Can't do that. But what moment in time where you just look at this thing and you go, I could paint on that? Like, does that just come to you in a dream, or what happens?
Well, I think ever since I started, since the first one, it's really hard for me not to notice walls. It was kind of driving my family crazy. Like, we're in the car driving, like in Bahrain when I was visiting. I'd be like, oh, that wall should totally have a that wall should have... So, yeah, I just,
Wow.
I'm not sure if I answered your question.
That's so interesting though, because you are seeing walls and buildings as canvas. You see them.
Yeah, exactly.
You see them differently than I would see them. Okay, I would look at them and I see a wall. You have this ability to look at that and see the potential that it's a canvas that you can play on, that you can make your mark on and figure that out. So let me ask you, as you're planning these murals, because obviously you have to plan, you're planning at a much smaller scale, and I guess this is where the architecture comes in. You're planning at scale, and then you're scaling it up. So help me understand, how do you see it small, and then how do you actually expand it and get it onto the canvas? Because you can't be using a traditional mean. I don't think you're projecting that image on there, are you?
No, not for the large murals. I have used a projector a couple times for smaller pieces.
Yeah.
But I think for larger ones, it's just too much of a pain, and you lose the resolution. And if it's outside, you can't do that anyway. So, I don't think it's humanly possible for anybody to say you're working on something like 100 feet, and you're right up at the wall, to know exactly what you're doing. I don't think physically, it's all about the reference points. So, say a grid, or the if there's concrete blocks, the mortar joints, that could be your grid, or you can create your own grid. So say the wall's 100 feet, you divide it up into whatever increments you want depending on how detailed the wall is, and then mark out lines, horizontal and vertical. If it's really big like that, with every project, my approach will change to be whatever's efficient based on the size and the style of the design. But that's one of the methods I've done where it really helps to have that kind of grid, and then I superimpose, on the computer or my iPad, the design on the grid. So I have that reference on paper that I'm looking at on site, and then I have the grid in reality, so I can always have, I just call it a reference point, I really know. Another method, that I see people use a lot, I actually haven't used it myself, but it's another type of grid. They call it the doodle grid, where you go to the wall and just do whatever you want, just make it up, just doodle all over it. Then you take a photo and then you overlay that on top of your design. So that's your grid. And then so you print it out so you could see your art and the doodles on top, so you know where the outlines should be relative to the doodles, and then in real life.
It's amazing. I mean, again, who would think that you could use doodling as a reference? I mean, you know what? Artists are amazing to me, and my wife and I love watching Portrait Artist of the Year, and we like to watch Landscape Artists of the Year, which are television shows from the UK. And we find the whole just creative process so interesting. We also love watching the show on Netflix called Blown Away, which is glassmakers. And, my wife took up painting a couple of years ago. I don't paint, I don't do any of that. But I love watching the creative process. And I love understanding and getting a sense of how artists come at these things, and how artists create out of these environments, either realistic environments or more made up environments, more envisioned environments. That is very fascinating to me, and the media that you choose to use. So let me ask you: you started that first thing, you use spray paint. Mm-hmm. So do you typically always use spray paint, or do you vary what you're using depending on the application and what you want to do, or how do you decide what you're going to go at it with?
I use both spray paint and acrylics, but the acrylics I use are, like wall paint, but 100% acrylic. The small bottles that you get, like at, Curry's art store or whatever, wouldn't work for a large scale.
Right.
And they're not usually meant for the outdoors. But my selection will be based on a few factors. Say I want to do, if it's indoors or outdoors. If it's indoors, I usually prefer not to do spray paint, unless they want a very specific aesthetic that is achieved through spray paint, and that's style that I did a lot of with like gradients and stuff like that. Then I do need to use spray paint for that. But there's an issue of ventilation, whatever. Right. But also the style, like if there's areas where there's just like big sections of flat color, then I don't really necessarily need to use spray paint. I can roll that down and then spray on top. So it's kind of usually a combo of both, or I'll use a brush for more detailed kind of designs and acrylic for that.
Interesting. And are you doing commission work? Meaning, like, is a client coming with a vision and saying, "This is what I want. This is what I need you to do"? Are you primarily given free reign and freedom to start with whatever it is you want to do? Like, how does that part of the process work with your clients?
Yeah. So all of my work so far, all of my mural work anyway, is commissions. Mm-hmm. But it's very important to me personally as an artist to have free reign on what I do and like actually come up with a design myself. So sometimes I'm given just like carte blanche, I guess is the word, like just do whatever you want, like, or we just want something colorful or abstract. And then sometimes there is a theme, like we want this to be botanically inspired, or we want this to have these colors in it, but other than that, do what you want. So I don't mind having that kind of input, like a theme or color palette or just general stuff like that. Like the one I did recently at the University of Waterloo, it was all math inspired. But that's the extent, I think, of that I'm personally willing to do. I know other mural artists that even will just they'll be given the design and they just execute it. So it's more of a sort of, I'd say, a technical skill, and they get really good at doing all kinds of different styles as well that way. Mm-hmm. So there's different ways you could go about this as a career, but I've always seen myself as an artist first and muralist second.
Interesting.
Yes.
No, yeah. Well, and you know what, Steph, I think that's really important because, again, I think it's important for us to we're talking about canvases, we're talking about, boundaries, and paper was a boundary you had to break free. But at the same time, I think it's healthy for us to have some personal boundaries about what we're going to do and what we're not going to do.
Yeah.
In whether we're an artist, or whether we do anything else for a living, or just personal boundaries. I think it's good. It's important to have boundaries. So and some people are okay saying I'll do whatever, but you're very clear about, look, this has to be true for me for it to work. And by the way, I'm the same way in my own business when it comes to training and consulting and the works that I do, is that I have certain boundaries or parameters in which I want to engage a client in. And lots of clients, want to be engaged in different ways, and I'm happy to say that's great, but that's not for me. And I think it's important, to protect your own, have integrity and protect your own value set and your own personage in the process, is that you got to establish what it is that you are willing and not willing to do, because if not, you sort of sell out a portion of something eventually in the process. And I don't think that's a good compromise. So I like the fact that at one level you got this free spirit, you want to do this great design, but at the same time you've got parameters that you want to put that gift and that expression into. And I want to honor that, because I think that's really important, because I think sometimes we can compromise things that are not good. And by doing that, we sell a part of ourselves in the process. I think there's a problem that happens if we just look at some of this just purely transactional. And so I like your perspective on that, Steph. I think it's really healthy, and I think it's whole.
Yeah, I think, well, that has always been a bit of a challenge, figuring out where to draw the line. And I definitely will admit didn't have this position in the beginning. Like, I've been doing this for about 6 years now. I was definitely saying yes to more things and getting more prescribed ideas of what a client will want, and doing that. And I didn't feel like it was true to what I wanted to do. So I've definitely been there and then learned from that, and it's like, okay, I don't want to do that again.
Yeah.
So yeah, it was just about figuring that out, I think.
No. Yeah, and we got to figure it out along the way for sure. So let me ask you, you've had these experiences now, you've been doing this for a career for a while, which is amazing. So what has all the things that you've done so far and the experience you've had, what's it teaching you about yourself along the way? What have you learned about Steph, and what have you learned about other people as you've interacted with them and watched them with, experience your murals and go that? What have you learned about others, and what have you learned about yourself along the way, do you think?
Yeah, I actually really like this question, and I've never been asked this before, ever. So I think doing murals has taught me that it's gonna sound really weird, but I'm braver and I have more kind of confidence or belief in myself than I thought I did. Like because when I did that first mural for that building across from the School of Architecture, like when I look back, I think that was kind of, because I'm someone who has always struggled with low self-esteem and shy, introverted, but art was this thing where I felt more confident, but I was still, as a person, not. So, and then somehow I was brave enough to take on this building that not only the public would see, but all the people, like my peers at the architecture school, who were studying architecture and not doing anything to do with painting, and like my professors. So the fact that I'm the type of person that would fear judgment and care about what people think, that somehow I was so excited by what I was doing, so driven by it, that somehow overpowered that fear. And then I was having a conversation with my friend, and she was telling me your art is who you want to be. I know it sounds weird, but it was like an epiphany. It kind of made me realize that about myself. My art is always so vibrant and colorful and bold, and it's I want to be that person, but I am through the art. So the art is my voice.
Yeah.
And I learned that about myself, that's how I make my mark, and it's enabled me to have this kind of confidence.
Oh, that, Steph, it's really interesting. I mean, first of all, you start off by saying this might sound a bit weird. I don't think it sounds weird at all. I think it's just, it's not weird, it's wonderful. And what I'm hearing you tell me, which is just coming to me as we talk, it's like your art has helped you scale. See, you talk
Yeah.
about how you saw yourself small and afraid and insecure and sort of hiding, and your art has become this expression of who you want to be, but it's also allowed you to start scaling your own perspective of yourself. Because
Exactly.
that really, to me, as much as your art is amazing, Steph, the journey you're on is powerful because your art is becoming this place where you see yourself small, but the art allows you to see yourself bigger. And I would say, I'd agree, that's a big, bold move to sit in your architecture class at university and look across across the road at a building and say, I'm going to make my mark on that thing over there. A place you can't hide it. It's in your face. That's bold. That's excuse my language. That's ballsy. I mean, that's crazy. And the fact that you're at a point in your life where from up until this point, you've seen yourself as sort of small and a bit insecure and self-conscious. And all of a sudden now, your art is allowing you to free a part of yourself. And I think that is a powerful part of your journey, that you don't just work at scale, but your journey is allowing you to see yourself differently. And I would suggest, Steph, maybe allow you to see yourself the way people see you. You know, I think sometimes, and we all suffer from this. We see ourselves on the inside. We see all of our failures and our faults. We compare our worst characteristics to the best characteristics of others. You know, we compare our worst art to the best art of others, and then we see ourselves as inferior. But you are on this grand journey of expression, but also of expressing yourself. Who is Steph? What is Steph going to be, and how is Steph going to express herself? And I think that's a powerful part of the journey. Again, if you're listening in, I just really encourage you. What do you need to do in your life so you can start scaling your own belief about yourself? Because when we scale our belief, then all bets are off the table. Right? As soon as we start scaling our belief and our ability or our capacity, then our ability and capacity expands to that. And in a sense, your belief about yourself is expanding because of what you're doing, Steph. And it's a powerfully wonderful journey. And I think it's just fascinating. It's a fascinating journey. I love it.
Thank you.
So what's the biggest scale you would want to work on? Like if you could work, like you've worked on stuff 100 feet, 200 feet. What's your biggest scale that you've worked?
Yeah, around that. But I've never done a multi-story building. Like I think the tallest I've done is 25 feet or 30 feet. But
Okay.
I'd love to do like a full tower.
Would you like to do a whole building?
I mean, actually, one thing I'd love to do really is be involved in creating this kind of mural in quotation mark or art for a building like that, but with the architect. Like it doesn't have to be painted. It could be integrated in the material. Like I've seen buildings even here do that, where there's a unique artwork that's printed behind, like, I don't know, on a glass or something, and it lasts longer than paint.
Oh, so listen, if you're listening in and you got a building and a vision, you should talk to Steph. Steph, the one thing, I mean, it's not the same kind of mural you're doing, but when I think about this, I think, and I don't even know what it's called, but in downtown Toronto, there is this building where there's a park, and this building, sort of the road wraps around it. I don't even remember exactly where it is, but a beautiful park area, and the road sort of wraps around this building, and it's a beautiful building, but there's this mural painted, and it looks like part of the building's being sort of unzipped and coming down. It's just this fascinating space. And that to me is so powerfully impressive when you change the way something looks. And the one thing I would say is, looking at some of your art, because you do a lot of different shapes, but you have some art, some murals that is very geometric.
Yeah.
It changes the way you experience the building when I've looked at some of this stuff, because it's almost like it's pulling you into almost like a tunnel which doesn't exist. But because
Exactly,
you're working
yeah.
with these geometric shapes and because of your architecture background, it's almost like by perspective you're going inside the space. And so spatially, it's no longer flat, which is
Exactly,
really,
yeah.
really creative. I mean, I love that. That's really very fascinating.
Yeah, I'm still fascinated by that, and I want to explore that even more, honestly, than I have. Um, I think back in architecture school, I was thinking about that, how, like say there's a cube, but the different ways you can paint it, you can, it'll change how you read. So all of a sudden, the 2D will overpower the 3D,
Yeah.
and I think that's really interesting.
Oh yeah,
Um,
I mean, you're playing with light and space, and you're playing with all this stuff. Steph, it's an amazing thing. So let me ask you. I mean, so much of what we're talking about already takes into this. I mean, my podcast is called the UNCOMMODiFiED podcast. It's all about standing out, being different, which you're already doing as an artist. There's not very many people who are doing the kind of art you do at the scale that you do, and so that in and of itself is an uncommodifying journey for sure. But let me ask you, when Steph sort of enters into a space with people, and you're holding space with other humans, and you're bringing sort of your unique contribution into that space, what are you bringing into that space that you know is sort of the special thing that you have for the people you encounter?
I think when I am feeling my most myself, like when I'm completely at ease and I say my most authentic self and not
Mm-hmm.
reserved, what people see is joy and humor.
Mm.
I think I make people, like the people that are close to me, I make them laugh,
Mm.
um, but like in a really silly way. And I like, and I think the art aspect, just it's a different side of me, but also like the colorfulness of it. Like I think seeing bright colors like releases dopamine. I don't know.
Yeah.
I think just joy and delight is what I hope that I bring to people around me. So whether it's through making them laugh and being a total goofball because I'm extremely silly, um, or if they don't even meet me at all, but they just see my artwork and it makes them smile. Actually, on social media, every now and then I'll see someone sharing a picture that they took in front of my art and saying how it really like cheered them up or like
Mm.
it impacted them some way, and that means so much to me.
Yeah, that's powerful. And by the way, I just want to know, for those of you watching the YouTube channel, my shirt is giving you all a massive jolt of dopamine right now because I put the colorful shirt on in celebration of sitting down with Steph, this amazing artist. Steph, you know what? What a great conversation. I really appreciate it. And I want to go back to something we said earlier because I just think it's so interesting. You have two provocateurs in your life. You have Miss Smart. You have the person who's a provocateur who calls something out of you, encourages you to go beyond the boundaries that you're being limited by. And then you come to a moment of time in your life where you come to a place of pain, which also becomes a provocateur, where it somehow it speaks to you and tells you this isn't the right place. And that then moves you out again. It's like Mrs. Smart's provocation moves you beyond the boundary of the paper. And in this case, the pain that you experienced in that workplace moves you beyond the boundary of that job and experience. And without these provocateurs, you might settle for a much smaller expression of yourself. And so again, if you're listening in, sometimes it's pleasure, sometimes it's pain. Sometimes it's a person, sometimes it's a circumstance. Sometimes it's a problem. But sometimes these things come to us as provocateurs. They come to us to actually push us out. It's sort of like not a mother hen who broods over us, but an eagle that pushes their young out of the nest, out of the boundaries of security and safety, and pushes that eaglet out into the world to fly. And Steph, it's amazing to me that you've had these people in your life and even, unfortunately, difficult circumstances, but it's all pushing you out. And to see what you do now and how you fly and how you're flying as a result of that, that's the goal that comes in the midst of that. So again, if you're listening in, just think about Steph's journey and think about where she's come from, where she's going, how she's expressed herself, and ask yourself, what does this mean to you? Just that would be my strong provocation to you. Steph, if people wanted to find you, if they've got this, 30-story building that they want you to paint on, how do they find you? What's the best way to find Steph?
Well, you can go to my website, www.stephanieboutari.com. That's StephanieBoutari.com. And then so all my contact info is there, or find me on Instagram. It's just StephBoutari.com.
That's awesome.
Yeah.
Listen, hunt down Steph. Check it out. If you want a great expression of art at your place, you need to talk to her. She can do it. I know she can, and she's amazing at it. Steph, thank you so much for spending time with me tonight. Thanks for being an encouragement to me. I'm really challenged that, I've got some places that I've paint small in my life sometimes. I gotta think bigger. I gotta think a bigger scale, and I've been encouraged to do that as a result of this conversation. Again, we're gonna end where we started, and that's with this. This is what I said when we started. I'm gonna say it again. If you can see it small and dream it big, you can scale it up. And when you push beyond the confines of your personal and professional canvases, you'll begin to live large and create vast and vibrant images and impact. Thanks for joining us. Have an excellent day. Listen, look me up on social media or email me at tim@uncommodified.com, and let Steph and I know how this conversation is becoming a provocation to you so that you can bring the wonderful color that you were destined to bring into your world. The world needs it desperately, absolutely, from you. Thanks for listening in. Cheers.
Thank you.